All right, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending Breakout session number 1 on cross-border trade and logistics. My name is Kelly Anshaw. I am a partner at Hogan Lovells, as well as a senior advisor, a non-resident senior advisor here at CSIS, and an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School. I am really excited about this topic for a lot of reasons. Number one, I am a self-professed trade nerd. I was a trade negotiator with the United States government for 10 years in a variety of roles, and now work on trade issues and find the topic incredibly fascinating and also important. It really is where the rubber hits the road in terms of Ukrainian reconstruction and private investment and growing Ukraine's economy. It's really important to be able to get goods in the country and back out of the country. And there are a number of challenges that Ukraine is currently facing in terms of doing that, which we'll get to. So many involve physical infrastructure, roads, hospitals, rail, what's happening in the Black Sea. There are other types of challenges as well related to logistics and infrastructure. But we have an amazing panel today that is truly representative of a lot of the activity happening in the private sector. And I'll start first with our government official, who is Andrei Ivko, the first deputy head of the Agency for Restoration of Ukraine. We also have just next to me, Andy Hunter from the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. We've got Matt OMara, Senior Director, International Relations from ADM, and Mike Stenson, Executive Project Director for Kingspan. And I'm going to turn the floor over to them in just 1 minute to introduce themselves more fully and talk a bit more about what their companies and organizations are doing in Ukraine. But just to give you a highlight of the conversation that we'll have today, and I'll leave time at the end for questions and answers from all of you, and I hope that you'll have many. But we're going to talk about some of the opportunities that are available in Ukraine right now to trade and to do business. And we've got a couple of exciting announcements to outline some of the sectors where there's tremendous growth. The World Bank predicted that for 2023, growth would increase by 0.5% as compared to 2022, where we saw a 30% contraction. So it is an exciting time to see what the Ukrainian economy can do. But we'll also talk about some of the challenges related to the war, related to infrastructure, and other issues, and also what other governments can be doing and what we as the private sector can be doing to help spur on growth in Ukraine and take advantage of these opportunities. So with that, I would like to give each of the panelists just an introduction to introduce themselves to you and to the topic to get the conversation started. And first we will start with Mr. Ivko.
Доброго дня, вітаю всіх присутніх.
Oh, and just for the audience, we will have a translation for Mr. Ivko.
Greetings to all of you.
Okay. Firstly, I want to say thank you for support that the United States has showed Ukraine in this extremely challenging period of our history. To begin with, let me share a bit about agency. Our work on rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure started in the first week of the invasion. The government focused on restoring roads, bridges, and energy infrastructure. However, there was a need for a single effective entity to manage these reconstruction projects. That's where the State Agency for Restoration stepped in. In January 2023, the agency was created by merge the State Agency for Infrastructure Projects and State Roads Agency. This new agency is responsibility for Ukraine's reconstruction projects. The agency scope of responsibility including critical infrastructure like energy and utilities, transport infrastructure including bridges and roads, housing as well as construction of social and administrative facilities, border checkpoints, restoration of social infrastructure. Despite the great shock that Ukraine's transportation and logistics system experienced at the beginning of the war, it has risen to the challenging and has been able to ensure the transportation of goods to and from Ukraine. Our goal is to maximize export potential, including the restoration and modernization of the checkpoints. Ukraine has 103 operating automobile checkpoints on the state border. Goals for 2023 to begin tender procedure for the design and repair of checkpoints in 2024, start large-scale reconstruction of the first 18 checkpoints. Ukraine has a road network. It's 170,000 kilometers, with 47,000 kilometers being state roads. This has been crucial for our logistics during the war. Signed February 24, 2022, in Ukraine, 25,000 kilometers of roads and 350 bridges and overpasses has been damaged and or destroyed. In region, we were fighting ongoing. We will build 86 temporary bridges. Many of they were supplied by partners from the USA, Czech Republic, France, Norway and Sweden. We thank our partners for their help. Result of our including 86 temporary bridges to 140 bridges fully restored. Agency operate also military logistic routes and transporting arms and equipment to the front, humanitarian and medical routes, evacuation corridors. Around 1 million people lost access to centralized water supply due to the Russian destroyed by Kakhovka hydroelectric station. The restoration agency is construction 150 kilometers of new water pipeline to provide water to residents of Nikopol, Marhanets, Kyiv, Kryvyi Rih, Tomakivka, and Pokrov. Engineer consultants and independent inspectors are working in the pipeline. Adaptability with the support of USAID, we make technical audit of the design documentation. We understand that transparency and accountability are essential for maintaining partners' trust and ensuring ongoing collaboration. We started ISO 37001 anti-burglary management system certification with our international partner support. Approved the agency and anti-corruption program and risk register. Develop a model anti-corruption program for the restoration services. We have a partner with global audit and consulting leaders. Ernst & Young, PricewaterhouseCoopers. In collaboration with EBRD, and we update our anti-corruption plan by experts from Basel Institute. We established a Transparency and Accountability Council with civil society representatives to ensure open agency operation. Adaptability, we have signed a memorandum with National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and at the end, together with your support, we can rebuild a strong and modern Ukraine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So maybe I'll start next with Andy to introduce himself from the American Chamber of Commerce and what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks, Kellyanne. My name is Andy Hanza. I head the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. We have over 600 members. We have a staff of 40 people, full-time staff 40 people. 33 are back in Ukraine. We are in Kyiv operating on the ground. We do three things. Number one, it's the B2G, getting the voice of business across to government. So we work very closely with the government in Ukraine and also the government in the United States. Secondly, B2B, we're a platform where companies come and they meet and it's networking. And thirdly, what we call B2U, Business to Ukraine, it's really getting the message out to audiences outside the country, what reality is, what are the realities of doing business in Ukraine. And that's hoping I'll be able to share that with you today, some of the realities of what our members are telling us to tell you what's going on in Ukraine today.
Great, thank you so much. And Matt.
Well, great. Thank you, Kellyanne. Thanks for the invitation today. So if you think about the Ukrainian flag, the symbolism behind the Ukrainian flag, it's blue skies over golden grain, fields of grain. And I think that is a motivation, inspiration for what I'm going to focus on today, which is helping the Ukrainian farmer. And the way to help them is finding the most efficient export routes possible for their grain. I'm Matt OMara, and I'm Senior Director for International Government Relations at ADM. ADM has a large footprint in Ukraine. We have 650 employees on the ground. We have an export terminal in Odessa, a crushing facility in Chornomorsk, and a network of inland storage and sales offices in the country. If you think about last year, the headlines were dominated with global food security, the impact of trapped grain in Ukraine, and the need to get it to the market. Private sector, governments were laser focused on finding alternative routes with the Black Sea closed. Routes through Europe, down into the Danube region, Constanta. It was all essential. But then the pressure built, and it was clear that a humanitarian corridor was going to be absolutely essential. And what I want to talk about today is why it's essential. It was a game changer. In the year that it was established, from late July of 2022 to August of 2023, the grain corridor plus the alternative routes helped Ukraine export significant volumes of grain, 70 million metric tons, which is actually, frankly, above the 5-year average. But fast forward to today, the Black Sea is again closed. Global food security is still top of mind, but maybe not every day are we opening up the newspapers or seeing on the news the impact of the war on the global south and elsewhere. But the Black Sea is closed, and we're now forced to rely on export routes that are simply not as effective, cost-effective, efficient. And what that means is the Ukrainian farmers getting squeezed. Prices are coming down, costs of transportation, infrastructure limits are increasing costs, and farmers getting squeezed. And the biggest concern we have is that the Ukrainian farmer will either stop producing because there's no incentive, or could possibly leave. And we see agriculture as a bridge to the future, and so we think agriculture is a bridge to rebuilding. So a lot of my comments might be focused on the here and now versus, say, grand plans for rebuilding, but I wanted to emphasize the importance of the logistics and the export piece and how that impacts the day-to-day of the farmer and the ability for them to continue.
That's great.
Thank you.
Mike.
Okay, so thank you very much, Kellyanne. And thanks to Dan for the invitation to be here. My name is Mike Stenson, and I'm the Executive Project Director of the Kingspan Building Technology Manufacturing Campus in Ukraine. We're planning an investment, as you might have heard from Sergei Zvitkach this morning, over a number of years that will total $300 million. The planning for this investment is already well underway. We have a project team of, from Delta and Gleeds and Baker McKenzie and others already in place on the ground. We have identified a preferred plot of land, and we're working very closely with Sergei and his team at Ukraine Invest and the Ukraine government, indeed, to move the project forward. Internally, the project, we've codenamed it Saoirse. Back home in Ireland, Saoirse is the Gaelic word for freedom, freedom from oppression. And the investment for us represents a vote of confidence in President Zelensky's ambition to rebuild the economy as a model for innovation in green technologies. So a little bit about Kingspan and who we are. We're a public company founded in and with headquarters in Ireland. Last year we had revenue of just over 8 billion euros, and we supply a variety of building materials for industrial, commercial and residential solutions. The solutions we provide are in areas around insulation, insulated metal panels, daylighting, roofing, membranes, and more recently district heating, pipework for district heating systems across our 5 divisions. We've more than 200 facilities across the world, operating in more than 80 countries with more than 22,000 employees. And we have 26 of those 200 facilities, manufacturing facilities, here in the United States. Kingspan's business model and strategy is enabling the transition from an outdated, inefficient method of construction to ultra-high performance building envelopes. 39% of CO2 emissions comes from the construction sector, and therefore the decarbonisation of buildings and building materials is absolutely critical to the energy independence, resilience and the transition to a clean or cleaner energy future. And that work is fundamentally Kingspan's focus as a business across the globe. Our campus in Ukraine, which we announced in June 2022, as I said, will be a $300 million investment, and will use renewable energy insofar as is possible as the energy source for the facility. The Kingspan investment will accelerate the adoption of these lower carbon, more energy efficient solutions there, and I think it will contribute to an overall lower carbon economy in Ukraine post-war. The site, when it's up and running over the next number of years at capacity, will employ 700 people. And the output from the campus will be a set of value-add products or higher value-add products for the Ukrainian economy that will be used locally or exported back into the EU. And also the campus will be a knowledge centre for low-carbon construction, which, as I said, is going to be very important. So at Kingspan, we're all tremendously enthused about making this project a reality in the coming period of time, the next months and years.
And Mike, I'm glad we ended with you because I want to start with the opportunity piece of this conversation. There are obviously a tremendous number of challenges to overcome, which we'll get into. But there is a temptation for those who don't follow what's happening very closely to think this is a country at war, the economy must be at a standstill, but that's actually not the case at all. And the Ukrainian economy, as we said from the top, is growing, and we have exciting investments of $300 million from the manufacturing sector. So maybe I'll direct this first to Mr. Ivko and then to Andy, both from your perspective on the government and the ground, and then Andy representing broader industry. Where are the areas where you see the Ukrainian economy growing right now? And we'll get into some of the trade challenges and logistical and infrastructure challenges, but just in terms of the industries where there's the most potential, perhaps we can start with painting a picture.
Так, дякую за увагу. З моєї думки, потенціал росту.
Okay, well, talking about from Mike.
Так, потенціал росту економіки це можливий тільки за рахунок фінансування і фінансування відновлення країни.
Well, so the only actual potential of growth is thanks to, assistance in restoring the potential of our country.
Тому що це додаткові кошти, які будуть використовуватися також і в країні.
So we're talking about additional monies basically that will be used in our country as well.
Але ми відкриті до компаній і компаніям з великим досвідом.
But we're also open to all kinds of companies, all kinds of businesses with great experience.
для того, щоб навчитись вже безпосередньо там працювати таким чином, з такою якостю, як світові лідери.
So basically that we would be able to learn from their experience and work and produce the same kind of quality as the world leaders.
Також ми плануємо і впроваджуємо ті реформи і ті напрямки, які приводять нас до цивілізованого світу.
Well, and also we're working on the solutions and working on the strategies that will bring us closer to the civilized world.
Один із напрямків пріоритетний – це безпосередньо прозорість і підзвітність і відкритість всім донорам та населенню України.
So one of those areas is being transparent, being open, being accountable to our donors as well as to the population of Ukraine.
Також партнерам, і ми намагаємося бути повністю чесними, прозорими перед усіма.
As well as to our partners. So we try to be as open as possible and honest as possible, pretty much in the face of everybody.
Тільки за умови таких напрямків і прозорості і залучення безпосередньо світових компаній, які б змогли б відновлювати країну, і це і буде точка росту економіки країни.
So again, thanks to this transparency, to be open to any party that will be participating in rebuilding Ukraine. So that actually presents a major growth potential.
That's great. Thank you. And perhaps we can get a new mic as well for the next set of comments.
Yeah, I think 84% of our members are up and running and functioning in Ukraine. We have 24 committees, so 24 different sectors which we are actively working on. Something brand new to us is during the war in December of last year, we launched a brand new Security and Defense Committee. We have companies like Glenn's here from Parsons and other companies like Boeing, Lockheed Martin. Boeing already today in Ukraine. In Kyiv, Boeing employ 1,100 people. 1,100 people are working in Kyiv today for Boeing. But if you allow me, I want to step back just before, if we go back to February of 2022, we had contingency plans in place. I mean, we were told, you know, the war, it's going to happen soon. We didn't know when. So we had contingency plans in place. And just want to focus on three things that part of the contingency plan. So one of the things, every evening, I went to bed. Well, if it's still in February, we paid out salaries in advance. We made sure that everyone had salaries. We said, you know, you're free to go. Anybody who wants to leave could leave the country. This is when still the borders were open. Out of 40 people, one person left. Everyone was there. But three things we had. So every evening I went to bed, I had a full tank of fuel in the car and 2 jerry cans in the trunk because we were told there'll be no fuel. We had cash, so we had local currency, hryvnia. We had dollars because we told, you know, the banking sector would be put out. And then we bought paper maps because paper maps in order to be able to travel because we told there'll be nothing. If we look where we are today, so the fuel sector, why this is so important for trade is you need the fuel to keep the infrastructure, the transport moving. So on February 1st, 2022, 80% of all the fuel coming into Ukraine came from either Russia or Belarus, 80%. And the plan was that once the war started, that would just be cut off and Ukraine would have no fuel whatsoever. The banking sector, the plan was to hit the banking sector, and even on the 24th of February, as people were evacuating, you could see the queues, the biggest queues were, the lines were at the gas stations and at the ATMs, the banks, people withdrawing cash. And then again, the communications. But what we've seen, I think the banking sector continues to operate. It's banks like we have Citi, companies like MasterCard, like Visa, they've continued to operate, and that the service is seamless. Why? What happens is because, again, there have been many American companies like Cisco, like IBM, like Google, like Microsoft. If during the Second World War, the key infrastructure was brought underground into the tunnels, this war, the key infrastructure was moved up into the cloud, and that's the safest place. And that's why we have continued banking services. The paper maps we had, I never had to use because the communications, the internet works better in wartime Kyiv than it does in many European cities. And it just shows, great companies that are operating. And you come to Kyiv, sometimes if you're on a Zoom call with Kyiv, at other cities you see like either fuzzy screen or the calls dropping. In Kyiv, it's where you have great companies using great American equipment. And then on the fuel, so what happens with the fuel? The companies that have been mainly in the downstream sector, they managed in 2 months to fully reorganize their business. So the whole 80% that was coming from Russia, that came from Belarus, that stopped, nothing was coming in. And in 2 months, they managed to turn around everything in their business. Something usually takes 3 years, they managed to do it in 2 months. And that's why the trucks, it was finding the trucks, it was finding the fuel, and many of the operators, the fuel stations, they all merged together because they had to keep the country ticking over. And that's really what we're seeing. We're seeing this phenomenal resilience of the private sector during the war, and that's why the economy continues. I think it is. We work closely with companies like ADM, sort of the ABCDs, the ADM, Bunge, Cargills, the others, and representing them. But I think just it's really understanding what the realities are. So we see the phenomenal resilience on the front lines of the soldiers, of the women and men that are defending the country. But we're seeing phenomenal resilience of the business community. And we've actually done some work on this together with McKinsey. There's a study out. Really global leaders are looking at Ukraine now. What it is, how do you manage a business during a full-scale invasion? And how do you manage a successful business?
No, it's really fascinating, and I really like your analogy about what was happening in the tunnels is now happening in the clouds. It's really a testament to the technological advancement and the creativity of the Ukrainian economy and everybody else who's come in to support it. So I want to turn and zero in on the two sectors that we have here represented on the panel. And agriculture in particular is a huge part of Ukraine's economy. And before the war, 40% of all Ukrainian exports were ag products. And so, Matt, you talked about the Black Sea and the challenges there, but I wonder if you can get a bit more into some of the trade-related issues that you're facing now in trying to grow that industry and keep it going. So feel free to elaborate on the Black Sea, of course, but also, what about alternative routes? We had a chat about the challenges in trucking or using the rail system and some of the issues there, not just in terms of getting your goods out as an export-based economy, but also in getting the grain from the farmers in the first place to those ports and through the borders.
Great, thank you. Well, keep in mind that pre-war, 95% of Ukraine's agricultural exports left through the Black Sea. I mean, the Black Sea is, Ukraine is geographically blessed with this export route that services the world. Ukraine, for a reason, is the breadbasket of the world. They produce much more product or commodities than they actually consume in country. So, 68% of the wheat, 82% of the corn that is produced in country is exported, and the world relies on it. And the Black Sea provides them this efficient route. Now, if you think about what's happened since. And for the American audience here, think about Route 95, Interstate 95 closing between Washington and New York on a holiday weekend, what that would do to the alternative routes, getting around. And think about it, for the non-Americans, any major highway that shuts down, it creates complete chaos. And the European Union early on, right after the war broke out, stood up solidarity lanes. They did a lot of good work to coordinate the cross-border transit of grains. We maximized to the extent possible the capacities in other Black Sea ports through Romania. All of that was extremely helpful, but it was really the Black Sea itself and the UN Grain Initiative that enabled grain to leave the country. We maxed, I think, before the Grain Initiative was established, we maxed monthly 3 million metric tons, where Ukraine traditionally exports 6 to 7 million metric tons per month. And so and Ukraine was coming off of a record crop the previous year, and so there was tons of grain that needed to be stored or exported, and that was the real challenge. So initial days, it was pretty amazing to see what was done to help facilitate things, and every month the export numbers would increase. I think fast forwarding to today, we have challenges of, I think, a somewhat similar nature, but also somewhat different in the sense that you have this whole situation created, necessitated basically going against the grain for all of exports. And what that did was, with the Europeans, for example, the local farmers started to get frustrated with the Ukrainian grain coming into Romania and Poland, and there was restrictions put in place this past May. That really caused a shock because it basically stopped the system overnight. You have a situation where you have basically one major road going from Odessa down to the Danube region, and having to move all of this grain down through into the Danube is an extreme feat, and it's extremely costly. So you have farmers that are now having to pay, transport costs now are about $100 per metric ton. And as I mentioned earlier, prices are coming down, so it's really squeezing their margins and squeezing the bottom line. So what do we need to see? I think a couple of things. One, security. Security plays a big role here because Russia has started to target Odessa and the other Black Sea ports. They're targeting the Danube. I would put mining in that category as well in terms of security. Farmers need to be able to farm with confidence, and I heard earlier 30% of arable land is now mined. ADM is supporting the demining effort through Halo Trust, and there's a lot of effort going into that, and we need to see more. The other piece is insurance. Think about it this way. Right now we're having to move everything from Odessa down into the Danube by truck, rail, and then barge. It's small volume compared to what we would normally do, and that adds extra costs. What we're trying to do is dredge the Salina Channel and bring in bigger sized vessels. The bigger the vessel you can get in, the more efficient the export route is. But we're having challenges because of the risk and insurance and covering the larger vessels. And because of that, we're more or less stuck loading massive Panamax vessels, 60,000 ton vessels via barge. The last thing simply is capacity. I mentioned the vessels, but capacity, infrastructure, a reliable power grid, improved rail, improved road. We need to see, and you mentioned earlier the customs and inspection. That is taking up a tremendous amount of time moving the grain from Odessa down into the Danube. Andy's group is doing a great job, and there's a lot, and I think the Ukrainian government has been very responsive. We need to see coordination between governments. Hopefully we can get past the EU restrictions. Hopefully we're seeing a path forward, but that's a big piece of it as well. So thank you.
No, I think that's really interesting to think about all of the different challenges you're facing just in terms of trying to get your goods out of the country. And I'll get back to the EU dispute because I do think it's quite interesting. But I want to turn to Mike to talk about the manufacturing sector. And granted that you have announced a facility that has yet to be built, but Ukraine's still a country that you do business in, and you decided to make this investment for a reason, notwithstanding some of the challenges. So we'd love to hear a bit more about some of the things you're thinking through in terms of issues you need to resolve as you're building out your facility on the trade and logistical side.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, we made the decision, while the war was in place, right? And we did it predominantly as a way of expanding our capability in Eastern Europe. And as I said, 50-50 will be between for Ukraine domestic production and the rest for export back into EU. So therefore, based on that, we need to be sure that the processes around that will work as best they can. I suppose where we're at with the project, we hope to start construction, let's say next July, as assuming everything goes okay in line with our current plans, and then it'll be a 5 to 7 year program after that. But some of the issues that we see, we've had a presence in Lviv importing building materials since 2005, so we have a lot of experience, right, without manufacturing it there. And some of the issues that we see, the road infrastructure, it remains an issue, and huge improvements are required to make it, flow well and work well, right? The customs processing and the whole customs process, again, can be improved. Utilities, and particularly for new investors, one of the things that surprised me was the lack of available, utility in terms of power and stuff like that. And again, we're working through all these. And I think that from our point of view, I'm an absolute optimist. And the good news for Ukraine is that the other countries in Eastern Europe, whether it's Poland or Czech Republic or Slovakia or whatever, had a lot of those challenges a generation ago. And there's a template there how to solve them. And therefore, there's nothing impossible in any of these issues that are there today in terms of roadblocks or challenges in relation to moving goods, right, actually. The last thing I'd say, though, is that for all of those challenges, the solution will have to be done, but it has to engage with local communities and local people. And I think that's a very important point about both the actions to be taken to solve the issues, as well as the general recovery program in the country. It has to be centred on communities and localities.
I want to turn to Andy to talk a bit maybe about some of the other sectors we haven't highlighted, given your broader membership, whether it's digital or energy or other companies you might represent. And then I'll turn it over to Mr. Ivko to respond to some of the challenges as well.
So I was speaking to one CEO of a very large company the other day, and sort of said, how's business? He goes, Andy, I'm embarrassed to say that the business is very good. Because the question that we're sort of juggling is, how during the war, do you say that you can do business and you can be profitable? And I think this is the message that we're actually looking at now, because it's sometimes juggling, because I think it's seeing the companies that they continue to operate. Some very tangible examples that are, Nestle, mentioned at the previous panel. They have already 3 plants in Ukraine. They have the chocolate factory in Lviv, they have the condiments and sauces factory in Volyn, and they have a pot noodle factory in Kharkiv. And the Kharkiv, they've reopened that factory. They had to make sure that they build the shelter, because it takes 45 seconds for a rocket to travel from the border to Kharkiv. And from Kharkiv, they export to over a dozen countries the pot noodles during the war. So they continue by land to export. Procter & Gamble, P&G, they had 2 factories. One factory, unfortunately, at the moment is closed because it's literally across the river from Enerhodar, from where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, and that was shelled. But they have another factory that's up and running near Boryspil, not far from where the airport is. And what do they manufacture? They manufacture female hygiene products, and they export to 20 countries across Europe. And I remember when Tori Newland, Deputy Secretary, came and she said, guys, why don't you write on the boxes, made in Ukraine? Because it's getting the message out to Europe. And then, my favorite factory used to be the Oreo factory in Sumy. Unfortunately, that was under occupation, that was destroyed, but they're coming up back again. So the Oreos will be coming back again, and they're making chocolate. This is a Mondelez factory. But literally on the other side in Uzhhorod, there's a big US company called Jabil. They have 3,600 people working there. And what they do is they make what George Clooney advertises all over the world. They make Nespresso coffee machines. So when you get home today, have a look at your coffee maker, turn it upside down, it says made in Ukraine. And during the war, they continue to export. I mean, so what are the challenges? I think, even some of those companies, obviously the challenges are now crossing the borders. Because as Matt said, nothing flies in, nothing flies out of Ukraine, so there's no air travel. The ports, apart from a very limited number of ports, are operating. So a lot of it now is either rail or land. And we see up to 7 days a truck can be stuck on the border. And what are we doing? I think we're actually trying to get, with working with the Ukrainian governments, but also getting the other governments to really open up more border crossings. I think that is essential. On the grain, I think one message that we want to deliver is this is essential for the grain, for the exports to continue. We are seeing the shelling continue. 49% of our members, one in two, have had destruction or damage to their offices, to their facilities, their plants. We had a hit last night, which we're trying we're getting details of. A well-known US company. No fatalities, no casualties, but there is damage to the plant. But in terms of the grain, I think we feel this is so important to continue. And I think our ask is really to protect the ports down in Odessa. And the only way we see that can be done is with the Patriot missiles. I think, if Patriot missiles were down, Kyiv, some would say Kyiv is one of the most protected cities in Europe now, because the Patriot missiles are safeguarding. And we need that, especially now in Odessa, for the grain corridor to continue, for the vessels, the deep the deep water vessels to come in, and for the trade to continue, because this is about global hunger, global trade, and I think this is so important to continue, because we do not see an alternative to the to the deep water Black Sea ports. I think that is essential for them to continue operating and to have the right protection in place.
Can I just come in there just to follow on from an earlier point that Andy made? We supply a lot of building materials for logistics centres and buildings and whatever. And interestingly, I mean, since the war started, our business is up probably about 30%, plus minus, right? And part of that is, where people have decided and businesses have decided to continue operating, right? Which is amazing, right, in so many levels, right? And the resilience and the courage, just has to be applauded of the people there. And, from our team, which is small today, to lots of other bigger companies that Andy mentioned, the resilience and courage is just amazing and should be really, really, applauded.
So, Mr. Ipko, I want to turn the floor over to you to respond to some of the concerns by private sector. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that your agency is helping to address some of the road destruction and the anti-corruption issues. And you're aware of the customs and border issues that have been raised today. Maybe you could talk about some of the priorities for helping companies get their goods in and out of the country and what you're working on right now.
Так, я тільки ви задали питання, набросав зразу безпосередньо приклади, з якими ми стикаємося практично кожного дня.
Right. So when you asked me this question, I actually jotted down some examples to show you kind of challenges we face every day.
І безпосередньо скажу конкретні кейси, які ми сьогодні вирішуємо.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about specific cases, something that we're trying to work on today.
Наприклад, перший кейс, зараз ми відновлюємо комплексно декілька декілька населених пунктів, але ми чекаємо, поки розмінують всі дома, всі там, де були російські війська, і ми чекаємо, і тільки потім приступаємо до виконання робіт.
Okay, so now we're working on rebuilding several communities, but if we start, working there, we have to complete the demining efforts. So we're talking about all the areas where the Russian, troops were. So only after we're done with demining, only then we can start rebuilding.
Це на прикладі робимо двох населених пунктів. Це посад Покровський в Херсонській області і це село Ягідне в Чернігівській області.
Okay, so working, in two communities, one in Kherson region, another in Chernihiv region.
Ще один виклик – це час.
Another challenge is time.
Тому що, на прикладі, коли була зруйнована російськими військами Каховська ГЕС.
Okay, so when the Kakhovka dam was ruined by the Russian troops,
і більше мільйона людей осталося без води.
so more than 1 million people were left without water.
І нам повинно було досить швидко зробити водопостачання декількох населених пунктів.
So very quickly we had to start supplying water to a number of communities.
На прикладі Кривого Рогу ми зробили за 76 днів байпас і проклали труби 50 кілометрів діаметром.
So all right. So we used Kryvyi Rih as an example, right? So in 176 days we made a bypass. So we put in pipes, 50 kilometers of worth of pipes.
Далі ракети щодня прилітають. От буквально сьогодні вночі ми займаємося захистом об'єктів критичної енергоінфраструктури нашої.
So we're getting hit by missiles every day. So we have to protect our critical infrastructure, obviously.
І сьогодні прилетіли буквально 3 ракети і зруйнували ту роботу, яку ми виконували тиждень.
Okay, but let's say today we got hit by 3 missiles, and it all damaged the entire work we put in a whole week into.
Спочатку був виклик також, це логістика. Це неможливо було доставити матеріали і працівників, але в перші дні війни ми зробили 86 зруйнованих мостів тимчасовими.
Okay, so again, logistics and getting personnel to work sites was a challenge, especially at the initial stage. Okay.
Матеріали.
Right. So but we actually created 86 temporary bridges.
Матеріали. Деякі підприємства в Україні сьогодні знизили виробництво, а деякі взагалі не можуть виготовляти матеріали. Деякі матеріали ми імпортуємо на сьогодні.
Okay, also talking about production facilities, some of our plants quit producing building materials, so some materials we have to import.
Також є деякі бюрократичні моменти, це довгі процедури, як нам на сьогодні вважається, тому що час для нас важливий, і ми сьогодні співпрацюємо з міжнародними фінансовими організаціями і спрощуємо процедури, тендерні процедури.
Well, also we have some bureaucratic hurdles we have to deal with. So we're trying to cooperate with international finance organizations, we're working on simplifying our procedures.
Також і останнє по пунктам пропуска, питання, яке ви задавали, то ми зараз збільшуємо пункти пропуска, зараз розробляємо програму, готуємося на наступний рік збільшувати і кількість, і пропускну здатність пунктів пропуску.
Well, also going back to the checkpoints, right? So at this point we're getting ready for next year, so we're going to increase the number of checkpoints as well as their capacity.
Так, і на сьогодні ми виконуємо проєктні роботи, feasibility стадії і плануємо вже безпосередньо в наступному році реконструювати деякі пункти пропуску.
Right. So at this point, again, we're working on the project documentation, feasibility studies, and we're going to restore a number of checkpoints next year.
Great. I want to switch quickly before we get to audience questions and answers, given the time, to external barriers, right? So we've highlighted some of the challenges within the country in terms of physical infrastructure and other issues, but talking about what's happening with third countries who are taking the goods from Ukraine or your export markets, right? Overnight, you stop being able to export to Russia. And the passageway east is a lot more precarious, particularly with what's happening with the Black Sea. So your markets are really more to the west, just geographically. So there's been a lot of attention in Matt, you raised the EU dispute, the WTO, which I want to talk about as well and would love for you to comment on. But what barriers to trade are you facing in the agriculture sector, in the manufacturing sector? And then, Andy, if you've been hearing of others, either from Europe, the United States, or other markets where companies want to develop and produce in Ukraine and export to. So maybe I'll start with you, Matt, since you raised the dispute.
Sure. Well, keep in mind, again, the flow of grain isn't normally through EU borders, right? And there were the efforts early on to create solidarity lanes and to facilitate the movement so that we could locate other ports. Ukraine grain might not go traditionally into Romania or Poland, but it certainly goes into Spain. Spain's a big buyer of Ukrainian corn. And traditionally we export that through the Black Sea, but having to do it by rail since the war. Look, I think Europe responded. The 5 countries that border Ukraine were increasingly upset, frustrated with the volume of grain coming in. They were suggesting that it was depressing prices. I mean, the fact of the matter is prices were coming down everywhere, not just in those countries. And they were moving forward unilaterally. And if we all know the rules of trade, you said you're a trade nerd, I am too. But the whole point of the European single market is they should act as one, right? So you have 5 European countries choosing not to do that. Created a lot of chaos. The safeguard measures were in place from May basically till last Friday, when Europe said that there was no need to maintain them. There was an understanding that there would be a mechanism to control, that Ukraine would create a mechanism to control. But at the end of the day, they're not supposed to have to do that. There is a free trade agreement, and it should govern. So what I understand is that there's talk of initiating a WTO process, but I hope we don't need to get to that point. I hope. I read this morning, in fact, that there's maybe some movement in a positive direction. I think the European countries did a ton to help, but I think anyone can understand that domestic politics sometimes create different situations. The other thing I'd point out, though, is China is the largest market for Ukrainian corn. However, Romanian ports aren't certified to export to China. So that's been another thing that our team's been working on to facilitate that process. So there are a lot of different things occurring because we're having to change the way trade traditionally flows. We're having to choose less efficient means. And so that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing that. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be improving these alternative routes. I think we should, in fact. But at the end of the day, it's just not set up that way. And it takes a lot of blocking and tackling to make these changes work.
Just to quickly follow up on the ag side, are there other markets that you or your sector would like to export to where there are barriers in place from countries that we can help push on in different forums to try to make it easier to export or to get a better deal, so to speak?
So, the Global South, the North Africa and Middle East and then you have Southeast Asia are major markets, and Ukrainian grain is geographically located to go. So we have not encountered from Ukraine any specific barriers, but it's something that we need to think about as we look towards rebuilding. Do we need to grow, open new markets? But I think there's an opportunity, but last year, given the fact that the world was really in a bad situation, fortunately, we saw countries keep barriers in check.
And Mike, I'll turn it over to you from the manufacturing perspective.
For external barriers, I mean, I think, exporting back into EU and even things like crossing the border, right? And I do that, or have done it fairly frequently. It's much more difficult to come back into the EU than to go from EU into Ukraine, right? For example, right? But I think one other very important point, and it's kind of a mixture of both external and internal, right, is around harmonization of rules and regulations. Again, particularly in our sector, in the building sector. And again, Ukraine has done made enormous progress in harmonization. But one specific example, is around, for example, our district heating solution. That's not harmonized at all, and it's still a very old-style, traditional solution in Ukraine that's completely different to what is required in Poland. So I don't know if it's an external barrier, but it certainly is a internal, external type barrier that we're hoping that over the next couple of years gets resolved, and all of the rules and regulations around the use of materials gets harmonized into EU regulatory framework.
And Andy?
Yeah, on the external, I'll probably say three things. Firstly, on the ag, all the news over the last 48 hours. I mean, Ukraine's trade representative, Taras Kachka, he was vice president at the AmCham. He was my vice president before he went on to the shop. I think he is now. I think they're reviewing the position, and I do believe that negotiations I hope there'll be negotiations to resolve this, because it's important. I think the support that Europe or many European countries have provided, I think there will be negotiations. Secondly, something that Mike touched on, it's crossing the borders. So we speak to many companies and they say, well, our head of security says no travel to Ukraine, you can't go. In order to have trade, you need people to crossing in and out. And I think we are having more trade delegations come in, and people are in Kyiv. Kyiv, Ukraine is open for business, and you're sat in Kyiv, and we could feel like sat here. It's continuous. So I think that's the people, both sort of U.S. policy on allowing more business to come in. I think we are going to see more trade delegations. We had the first delegation from Utah. We've had a number of trade delegations already come in, and I think that's so important. Something again that Mike touched on was about physically crossing the border. So when we were coming out of Kyiv, we drove to the border, and then we crossed on foot, and then we got a taxi from the Polish border to the airport. I find that the quickest way.
Yeah.
But I was surprised to find out that there are some border points. So, Deputy Minister, I think we will raise this with you, that some border points do not allow all citizens, including American citizens, to cross on foot into Ukraine. And then the alternative then is you have to sit in a car for like up to 8 hours. So that's something we will be raising, to allowing the free passage of borders. And thirdly, it's the mindset. This is more the tech sector we're saying. So Ukraine has a big tech sector, IT, $7.4 billion of services, 300,000 people employed in this sector. It's really a phenomenal story, what I've seen over the last 10 years. And what the companies are telling us is that there are companies in the US also that are saying, well, hang on, Ukraine's at war, maybe let's not do business with them until we see that. We feel that that's the wrong thing. On the contrary, we are saying do business with Ukrainians, because I think the resilience, the passion, the professionalism that they are showing more than ever, and especially the tech sector. The curfew now is what is it? Sorry. Midnight, yeah. But it used to be like much earlier. So all these programmers, instead of going to bars, they were all sat in their pajamas working away, and the actual the sector rose. So I think it's one thing we would ask. When you are speaking to tech companies, do business with Ukrainians. They will provide the goods, they'll provide the quality services, and this will be doing something good to help the country.
Yeah, can I just illustrate the point around the border crossing, the point you made? I've always, in times I've gone back and forth, done it on foot, and it's taken me, anything from 10 minutes to 35, right? I've colleagues, including colleague who's here with me today, right? Went by a combination of bus and car, and you were talking about 7 to 9 hours, right? So therefore, having a simple solution like every border crossing allowing you foot traffic is absolutely, just a practical, tangible, way of improving how to do business.
And so one question I have, and maybe this is for Mr. Ivko, but for any of the panelists who've been crossing the border and trying to deal with this, you mentioned looking into border crossings and improving that as part of your priorities. Has there been reception on the other end, right? I mean, Ukraine may want a border crossing, but Poland would also have to want that crossing as well. How has the relationship gone and discussions gone? Are the EU countries open to it?
Так, дійсно, ми сьогодні ведемо перемовини з країнами, з якими у нас спільний кордон.
Yes, really. So today we're in the process of negotiations with the countries we share our borders with.
На прикладі Польщі скажу таким чином, є пункт пропуска Краківець, який ми додатково зробили 6 швидких ліній, і збільшили пропускну спроможність безпосередньо в цей період.
So in Poland there is a border point Krakowec. So we added 6 express crossing lines there, which obviously increase their capacity.
Є у нас пункти пропуска, якими можна рухати пішки, а є ті, якими тільки легкові автівки, а є тільки там, де автобуси перетинають кордон.
So some crossing points you can only cross on foot, others you can only drive across in a car, and there are still others you can cross across in a bus.
З Польщею і з країнами Європейського Союзу є, скажімо так, не складнощі, а перемовини стосовно законодавства нашого і їх, яким чином треба проїжджати, яким чином треба декларувати товари.
And also, there are certain, I'd say, glitches basically between us and Poland and Union countries. So we are negotiating basically about the right ways to declare, let's say, goods, or the right way to cross, borders at different places.
Там більш складніша і бюрократичніша процедура, і це забирає час.
Over there, they have more complicated bureaucratic procedures, and they take time.
Але ми зараз співпрацюємо і ми плануємо налагодити нашу кросборд логістику стосовно автомобільних пунктів пропуску. Зараз спілкуємося з країнами, де ми додатково будемо в наступному році відкривати пункти пропуску.
So, all right. So we are working again with a number of our partners on creating crossing points for automobiles. And so next year we're going to open a number of additional crossing points.
Є питання стосовно черг з вантажівок.
There are issues with lines and lines of trucks.
Але ми зараз пропрацювали і впроваджуємо програмний продукт «Є черга».
At this point we have developed and we're introducing a new product called E-Line.
Тобто вантажівки мають безпосередньо годину, в якій можуть перетинати кордон.
So the trucks will be given a specific time slot when they will be able to cross the border.
Це знімає питання черг. І зараз ми впроваджуємо на одному пункті пропуску, це є годин, пункт пропуску з Польщею, але далі будемо масштабувати на всі пункти пропуску, щоб прибрати черги. І таким чином, коли ми приберемо черги траків, коли ми додатково відкриємо пункти пропуску і розширимо, реконструюємо існуючі, тоді буде досить гарне сполучення між нашими країнами.
So again, we're working on this E-line, Formula Line, one of the crossing points with Poland. So basically, at the time
when we add
additional crossing points,
when we improve the existing crossing points, and when there will be no lines for trucks, that will really help our transportation relations with our neighbors.
Very good.
That's great. Well, we have a couple of minutes left. I wanted to give the audience an opportunity to ask any questions. I saw your hand first. So.
Thank you. My name is David Rink. I'm Senior Agriculture Advisor at USAID Ukraine. And I want to ask, it's kind of a complex question, but it's really about something you mentioned, Matt, which is insurance, right? And I know, every sector in Ukraine is affected by the risk that's taken because of the conflict. But it strikes me, it's great to hear that Ukraine's open for business, but it strikes me that one sector in the economy that has experienced market failure is risk, is the insurance sector. And, you know, everything from input insurance for farm inputs to me, what's the cornerstone in my sector, which is the maritime insurance for the Black Sea, you know, is not functioning because the cost of those risk mitigation tools like insurance have been pushed beyond the cost where the market can use them, right? And so it strikes me what we need is a subsidized risk underwriting tool that can bring those prices, those costs of underwriting back in line with commercial reality. And, you know, I heard this morning Representative Hill say he's writing a bill to unlock some of these $3 billion in Russian sovereign funds that are locked up in financial institutions in the West behind sanctions. I think a great investment for a significant part of that money would be into a subsidy program for risk insurance. And that way, the Russians themselves have some control over how much compensation that they will pay for the things they destroy. But we've also heard other ideas and other concepts. I know President Zelensky and you guys have announced a subsidized maritime insurance program for the Black Sea. We've seen, though, another approach, which is Patriot missiles. This is not maybe insurance isn't the way to go because it's beyond the ability of an insurance tool, and it's really a defense issue. So I want to ask you guys, I wake up every morning and I read the reports from the Danube ports, and I remind everybody that these are not a replacement for the Black Sea, the major Black Sea ports because of the cost. And so to me, that's a case in point. Probably to me, the most important thing is the maritime insurance, but in general, what should we be doing at USAID to underwrite risk and facilitate business, particularly the trade business of the grains, but other sectors as well?
So I think this is a great question, but just in the interest of time, why don't I take a couple more questions and then the panelists can address all of them.
Hello. Hi, my name is Neil Cawley. I'm from EOT Global. We're a company channeling development into Ukraine, primarily in the manufacturing sector, into our industrial parks. We've discovered that the best way to do this is ground up. So what we've done is we've partnered with the Mayor's Club. We formed 14 economic unions consisting of 53 municipalities. We have close to 600 municipalities signed onto our web platform. And most recently, we're pleased to announce that Hughes Hubbard Reed has put together an anti-fraud course that 259 municipal leaders have signed up for. So we're very pleased, but we're finding that decentralization has given the local leaders a lot of authority. But do they know how to use it? How can they be better trained? And then my second question for you, Mike, would be, my parents are Irish, by the way, so launch it. Would be in terms of financing, that's our biggest thing. We're looking at special project vehicles to try to cut down on risk by guaranteeing a U.S. jurisdiction and by just making investors a little more comfortable. So how do you handle the financing part? So those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. And one more if there is one, and then we'll turn it back over. Okay. Well, why don't we start, and I'll turn this over to all of you, and maybe we can just go down the line. The question about the subsidized political risk insurance versus risk mitigation, how do we fix this problem? And then the financing question, which was specifically directed at Mike.
Happy to jump in.
Go for it.
Yep.
Well, I think we need to put our heads together on the insurance piece. We've had insurance issues since day one. They're complex, they're different in nature. What we were dealing with earlier on had to do with the capital controls and the flow of money out of Ukraine. ADM actually has its own reinsurance business, and we are happy to reinsure ourselves. We were just not able to do that because we couldn't actually move money in and out. Fortunately, Ukrainian government was very responsive and ultimately addressed that issue. But we have seen a major challenge with availability and cost premiums that are cost prohibitive. And that has limited our ability to scale in terms of these bigger vessels into the Danube in particular. I think things flow. Security's one, right? I think you need to see that. And then hopefully we'll see a reemergence of insurance options. I'll say it that way. I mean, there are local companies, but they only can take on so much risk. They need partners so your point about subsidizing or simply putting together reinsurance packages and pulling together options. I think there's probably many different ways to skin the cat, but it needs a lot of attention. And one thing I've struggled with is, frankly, and it was your colleagues earlier this week in New York that helped, begin the thinking, but we need to pull together industry on specifically insurance and think about creative ways to deal with this.
I'll just jump in because what Dan alluded to at the previous panel was a survey that we did, because we had exactly the same question. We were here like in June, and the question was, okay, well, what is the demand, what is the supply, what are the challenges? So we did a survey together with Aon, together with WTW, Wills, and with MIGA. So we have the numbers, we have the first sort of findings, but I fully agree with Matt. It's us sitting down together. We're looking at DFC. What is it that DFC can do on this? But I do agree, maybe we can sit down, and just go through, fine comb again the details and seeing, what the solutions could be.
Because I'm looking forward to a remote panel discussion at AmCham on Tuesday with DCA on risk financing.
Yes.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
I'd just point out that it's not just political, war risk insurance. It's just standard insurance. I mean, we've had trouble getting insurance just for our storage facilities that are, not necessarily in, haven't been harmed yet, fortunately. But even moving stocks in our trucks or by rail, we've had a lot of trouble fixing that issue. So it's complex and there's many layers. So thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question. I think we're in a kind of in a good position in terms of that. The way we see it at the moment is that the funding for this $300 million investment will be from internal sources from a balance sheet, right? However, we have an ongoing dialogue with EBRD and IFC. In particular, in relation to how they may co-finance elements and aspects of it, because it's good to bring people like them that have extensive experience, as you have heard in the previous panel, in terms of how they've done things in Ukraine and elsewhere over years. So that discussion is going on, but as it stands right now, it would be probably internally financed, all things being equal. But it's a good question, because I think the whole area around having, and having finance available, without it being wrapped up in too much bureaucracy, but at the same time being made available for people who want to use it is an important topic. I would add on the insurance side, again, we're in discussions with MIGA and DFC in relation to some specific political risk insurance and stuff like that. Again, as a company, that's an area we've never entered into because we haven't had the need in any of our existing 200 facilities, but that may be something we want to do, and we're at discussions, and indeed after this I have a meeting with some DFC people on Friday to see where that might go to.
Mr. Iko, would you like the last word?
Щира подяка ще раз вашій країні, країнам-партнерам, які нам сьогодні допомагають. І сьогодні ми, скажімо так, готуємось до масштабної відбудови. Сьогодні все планується, плануємо, впроваджуємо стратегічне планування і вважаємо, що ця війна скоро закінчиться, звичайно, перемогою всієї демократії над країною-агресором. І ще раз дякуємо за вашу увагу, дякуємо за запрошення і за вашу допомогу.
Well, again, first of all, I would like again to thank you for your extremely important support. At this point, we're getting ready for our rebuilding and recovery efforts. We're in the process of planning, focus on strategic planning first of all. We all hope that the war will be over soon, that it will end in our victory, in the victory of all democratic forces of the aggressor country. And again, thank you for your attention, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for your support.
So I'm not going to try and top that because I think that was a great way to end this. But just on behalf of CSIS, thank you so much for attending this panel. I want to extend a big thank you to all of our panelists for their amazing contributions. And it's always a good sign when a panel strikes and sparks dialogue on important issues and things that we can carry forward to really make this situation better when it comes to trade and logistics. But thank you all for your attention, and I would like to have everybody clap for our panelists.